shield us from the relentless challenges faced by Romans. Without these protections, even the simplest journey became a demanding, exhausting endeavor. Roman work routines, occupational hazards, and daily fatigue. Work in ancient Rome was relentless, physically demanding, and often hazardous. From sunrise until long after sunset, citizens, slaves, and laborers performed tasks that required strength, endurance, and vigilance. For a modern visitor, accustomed to mechanized labor or office work, the daily routine would be exhausting and unforgiving.
Most occupations involved continuous physical effort. Artisans, such as blacksmiths, carpenters, and potters, spent hours standing, bending, and manipulating heavy materials. Tools were simple and often unrefined, requiring greater skill and strength to operate. Precision was critical, as mistakes could ruin work, injure the craftsman, or anger patrons. Fatigue accumulated quickly, and even minor errors could have significant consequences. Agricultural labor was even more grueling. Fields demanded planting, tending, and harvesting crops by hand, often under the scorching sun. Watering, weeding, and transporting produce required immense stamina. Slaves and peasants bore the brunt of these tasks, facing exposure to insects, weather, and soil-borne pathogens. For someone unused to such labor, each day would be a trial of endurance, with muscles, joints, and energy taxed to their limits. Urban labor carried its own hazards. Builders constructed homes, temples, and public works with minimal safety measures. Heavy stones, wooden scaffolds, and rudimentary lifts posed risks of falls, crush injuries, or accidents. Tradespeople operated near open flames, molten metal, or sharp instruments, further increasing the potential for harm. Modern protective equipment was non-existent. Even minor injuries could become serious infections. Slaves and servants performed the majority of domestic and menial tasks. Carrying water, preparing meals, cleaning floors, and tending to livestock were physically exhausting chores performed under strict supervision. Fatigue was compounded by the constant need to avoid displeasing their masters. Modern expectations of regulated work hours, breaks, and labor protections were absent, creating a relentless rhythm of exertion. Even office-based occupations, such as scribes or clerks, involved long hours of meticulous work. Writing on wax tablets or scrolls required constant concentration and dexterity. Mistakes could have social, legal, or financial consequences. Eye strain, cramped hands, and mental fatigue were persistent challenges, highlighting that labor in Rome was both physical and cognitive. Market vendors faced continuous strain as well. Managing stalls, interacting with customers, carrying goods, and negotiating prices demanded attention, energy, and patience. The crowded, noisy environment added stress, while exposure to sun, rain, or cold contributed to physical discomfort. Merchants rarely had the luxury of resting during the workday. The survival of their trade depended on constant effort. Fatigue accumulated across multiple dimensions. Physical exertion, sensory overload, social vigilance, and exposure to environmental hazards created a pervasive weariness. For a modern visitor, unaccustomed to this level of sustained effort, even simple tasks like walking, carrying, or standing for extended periods would quickly become draining. The body, mind, and senses were in near constant demand. Rest was brief and often insufficient. Workers returned home to shared sleeping spaces, uncomfortable bedding, and ongoing household responsibilities. Meals were consumed quickly, hygiene was minimal, and social obligations continued. The cumulative effect of these routines left little room for recovery.
In summary, Roman work routines exemplified the relentless demands of daily life. Every occupation, from artisan to laborer to merchant, required endurance, skill, and attention. Modern assumptions of convenience, safety, and regulated labor were absent, making survival a continuous test of physical stamina and mental fortitude. The city's vibrancy and productivity masked the relentless toil underpinning every day.
Roman entertainment, leisure, and the physical strain of public spectacles. While ancient Rome is often celebrated for its grand entertainment and public spectacles, participation in these events was far from leisurely for the modern visitor. From gladiatorial games to theater performances and chariot races, attending or engaging in Roman entertainment demanded endurance, tolerance, and careful navigation of the social environment. The Colosseum, a vast amphitheater, was a central hub for spectacles. Tens of thousands of spectators crowded into tiered seating, with higher social classes occupying the front rows and common citizens relegated to the upper levels. The climb to these seats was physically taxing, involving narrow stairways, uneven steps, and long walks under the sun. For someone accustomed to modern stadium seating, the physical effort alone could induce fatigue before the event even began. Gladiatorial games were loud, intense, and often chaotic. The roar of the crowd, the clash of weapons, and the cries of combatants created a sensory overload. Spectators were expected to react, cheering, jeering, and showing approval or disapproval at appropriate moments. Misjudging these cues could invite disapproval or embarrassment. The combination of heat, noise, and the emotional intensity of the spectacle was draining, demanding mental and physical endurance. Chariot races, held in circuses such as the Circus Maximus, presented a different type of strain. Crowds surged to gain advantageous viewing positions, and space was limited. Noise from cheering, the pounding of hooves, and the clatter of wheels filled the air. For a modern visitor, maintaining balance, avoiding accidental contact with other spectators, and sustaining attention over long races was physically and mentally demanding. Theaters, too, required vigilance. Seating was hard and often cramped, while performances could last for hours. Patrons were expected to follow ritualized responses to the play, such as applause, laughter, or jeers at specific moments. Missing these cues could signal ignorance of social norms. Extended sitting, combined with crowded conditions, minimal ventilation, and noise, taxed both the body and mind. Leisure activities outside formal spectacles were equally taxing. Bathing in public baths, strolling in forums, or attending festivals required movement, endurance, and awareness of etiquette. Games, sports, and athletic contests often demanded physical exertion beyond what a modern sedentary person could sustain. Even simple participation involved navigating crowds, enduring sun or heat, and maintaining decorum. Comfort and convenience were secondary to the demands of social interaction and survival within the spectacle. The cumulative effect of attending public entertainment was significant. Extended exposure to noise, physical exertion, social vigilance, and sensory input created profound fatigue. Even leisure, which modern minds associate with relaxation, required resilience, endurance, and adaptability. A modern visitor, unused to constant physical and mental strain, would find these experiences exhausting rather than restorative. In summary, Roman entertainment and leisure were far from effortless. The grandeur and spectacle masked the underlying demands placed on the body and mind. Physical exertion, sensory overload, social complexity, and environmental challenges combined to make participation or observation an endurance exercise. For the unprepared modern visitor, the vibrancy of Roman entertainment could quickly become overwhelming, emphasizing that survival in the city required not only strength and vigilance, but stamina in every facet of life.
Roman religious life, rituals, and the physical demands of devotion. Religion permeated every aspect of Roman life, influencing behavior, social interactions, and even daily routines. Participation in religious activities, whether public or private, demanded attention, endurance, and adherence to complex rituals. For a modern visitor, accustomed to informal or optional religious practices, Roman devotion could feel exhausting and exacting. Temples and shrines dotted the city, each dedicated to a particular deity. Visiting a temple required knowledge of proper conduct, where to stand, how to present offerings, and the correct phrasing of prayers or invocations. Mistakes could result in social disapproval or the perception of impiety. For someone unfamiliar with these practices, even a brief visit could be mentally taxing, requiring constant focus to avoid missteps. Public rituals often involved long processions, sacrifices, and communal ceremonies. Priests and participants wore specific garments, carried tools, and performed movements according to tradition. Observing or participating demanded patience and physical endurance. Marching in processions, standing for extended periods, and enduring heat, dust, or crowds tested both mind and body. Sacrificial rites were central to Roman religious life. Animals were presented to gods in carefully prescribed ceremonies. Handling, restraining, and preparing animals involved labor, coordination, and attention to detail. Even observing these acts could be emotionally and mentally taxing for someone unfamiliar with the reality of ancient practices. The sights, smells, and sounds of sacrifice were intense and inescapable in public settings.
Private worship required ongoing effort as well. Household altars were maintained daily with offerings of food, wine, or incense. Cleaning, arranging, and presenting these offerings demanded precision. Neglect could be seen as disrespectful, bringing social or spiritual consequences. For a modern visitor, the daily responsibility of performing rituals correctly would be a constant source of stress. Festivals and holy days added layers of complexity. Events could last for hours or days, involving music, dance, games, and feasts. Participation often required travel to temples or public spaces, standing in crowds and following ritual schedules. The physical strain of attending multiple festivals, combined with sensory overload and social expectations, created fatigue similar to a full day of labor. Divination and augury, common elements of Roman religious practice, required interpretation and careful attention. Observing the flight of birds, the entrails of sacrificed animals, or the patterns of omens demanded knowledge and vigilance.
Misinterpretation could affect decisions at the household, political, or communal level. A modern visitor unfamiliar with these methods would be mentally strained simply trying to follow or understand them. Even prayer was physically demanding at times. Kneeling, bowing, or walking to sacred sites required endurance. Repetitive gestures over long periods, particularly during festivals or ceremonies, taxed muscles and stamina. Combined with heat, noise, and crowds, these physical demands made religious devotion an integral part of the daily exertion required for survival. In summary, Roman religious life, while spiritually significant to its participants, placed continual demands on body and mind. Rituals, sacrifices, festivals, and daily devotions required endurance, focus, and resilience. For a modern visitor, navigating the expectations, physical exertions, and social rules of Roman religion would be exhausting, emphasizing that even devotion in ancient Rome was intertwined with survival, effort, and vigilance.
Roman law, justice, and the mental strain of navigating legal systems. The legal system of ancient Rome, renowned for its complexity, was both a cornerstone of civic life and a source of constant stress for its citizens. For a modern visitor, accustomed to codified laws, written regulations, and systematic enforcement, navigating Roman justice could be bewildering, exhausting, and fraught with risk. Laws were intricate, derived from a combination of statutes, customary practices, and the interpretations of magistrates. Even minor infractions, failing to follow property boundaries, disputes over debt, or improper conduct in public spaces could result in fines, penalties, or more serious consequences. Understanding which rules applied in which contexts demanded continuous attention and careful observation. Courts, known as quaestiones or judicia, operated under procedures that emphasized rhetoric, persuasion, and social status. Presenting a case required knowledge of protocol, persuasive argumentation, and the ability to navigate social hierarchies. A modern person, unfamiliar with the nuances of Roman procedure, could easily misstep, inadvertently offending a magistrate or weakening their position. Magistrates and judges held considerable discretion. Their decisions often depended not only on law, but on social context, political influence, and personal judgment. Success in legal matters frequently required connections, resources, or patronage. For a modern visitor without such networks, even a minor dispute could escalate into an overwhelming challenge. Public trials were common and sometimes performed with great ceremony. Spectators, ranging from citizens to slaves, observed proceedings, and outcomes could influence reputation and social standing. Being involved in a trial, either as a plaintiff, defendant, or witness, demanded composure under scrutiny, attention to detail, and mental resilience. Mistakes in argumentation or behavior could have lasting consequences. Enforcement of laws varied. The lictors and other officials maintained order, but the application of justice was uneven, often influenced by wealth, status, or influence. A modern visitor might struggle to predict outcomes, adding to stress and anxiety. Even understanding which authorities to approach for resolution required careful knowledge of the hierarchy and social expectations. Debt and financial disputes were particularly hazardous. Credit agreements, loans, and property arrangements often lacked the clarity or legal safeguards of modern systems. Failure to meet obligations could result in social humiliation, seizure of property, or enslavement. Navigating these matters demanded vigilance, organization, and careful record-keeping. Criminal law carried severe consequences.
Theft, assault, or perceived slights could result in corporal punishment, fines, or exile. Trials for serious offenses were public, and outcomes could be unpredictable. A modern individual, accustomed to systematic protections, would find the variability and severity of punishment both frightening and exhausting. Even everyday interactions were influenced by the law. Contracts, property rights, and civic obligations permeated social life. Understanding legal obligations required continuous attention, observation, and memory. A single oversight, misplaced property, unpaid dues, or breach of social protocol could trigger legal action, demanding both energy and mental focus to address. In summary, the Roman legal system exemplified the intellectual and emotional demands placed on its citizens. Navigating laws, courts, and social expectations required constant vigilance, mental stamina, and strategic thinking. For a modern visitor, accustomed to clear, codified, and consistent systems, the intricacies and uncertainties of Roman justice would be both exhausting and potentially perilous. Life in the city was not only physically demanding, but mentally exacting, as survival depended on an intricate balance of observation, understanding, and careful compliance with social and legal norms. The relentless reality of life in ancient Rome. After exploring the countless facets of daily existence, streets crowded with animals and carts, markets teeming with noise and negotiation, labor that demanded every ounce of strength, meals prepared under hazardous conditions, and the mental strain of navigating social, religious, and legal expectations, it becomes painfully clear why a modern person would struggle to survive even a single day in ancient Rome. The city was vibrant, magnificent, and filled with human ingenuity, but beneath its grandeur lay an environment that tested the body, mind, and senses ceaselessly. Every step required vigilance. Every interaction carried potential risk. Every moment demanded endurance. Water was hard to carry, food was risky to eat, roads were dangerous, and social norms were unforgiving. Life was an unending exercise in adaptation, survival, and resilience. Even leisure and entertainment were not restful. Baths required physical effort. Games and spectacles demanded stamina, and religious rituals called for attention, precision, and endurance. Modern conveniences, sanitation, medical care, soft bedding, predictable work schedules, and safety regulations were absent. Every element of life, from rising in the morning to seeking sleep at night, was intertwined with hardship. The relentless demands of work, travel, food preparation, hygiene, social customs, law, and ritual created a constant, low-level exhaustion that would weigh on any modern visitor. The sensory overload, combined with physical exertion and mental vigilance, ensured that even surviving the day was an achievement. Comfort, convenience, and safety, qualities so often taken for granted, were luxuries unknown to Romans of all classes. To understand the reality of Rome is to understand endurance. It is to imagine walking cobbled streets for hours, negotiating markets, performing labor, observing rituals, and navigating hierarchies, all while maintaining attention to threats of illness, injury, and social error. For a modern person, the city would be overwhelming, exhausting, and utterly unforgiving. In the end, the story is not one of fear or doom, but of perspective. Ancient Rome, with all its glory, operated under conditions that demanded constant resilience, adaptability, and vigilance. A modern human, accustomed to comfort, predictability, and safety,
would quickly learn that survival required more than ingenuity or courage. It required endurance at every level: mental, physical, and emotional. So,
Failing to do so could result in overpaying or offending the merchant. For a modern person unaccustomed to this level of interaction, shopping was not a simple task, but a test of social awareness and endurance. The goods themselves could present difficulties. Food was often displayed without protection from dust, insects, or the crowd. Fresh produce, bread, and meat were exposed, and handling was commonplace. For a modern visitor, accustomed to packaging and sanitation standards, this could be both alarming and unappetizing. Eating or purchasing such items carried real risk of foodborne illness. Market interactions were also heavily influenced by social hierarchy. Wealthy citizens could command better service, while plebeians or visitors were treated differently. A modern person unfamiliar with these unwritten rules risked appearing rude or naive. Attention to detail in speech, posture, and timing was crucial to avoid social faux pas. Slaves often accompanied wealthier shoppers, carrying goods or negotiating on behalf of their masters, further emphasizing the complexity of navigating these interactions. The sensory environment added to the challenge. Smells of cooked food, fermented sauces, and animal waste mingled in ways that modern noses might find overwhelming. The heat of the day, combined with the exertion of walking and bargaining, could cause fatigue and lightheadedness. Noise from merchants, shoppers, animals, and street performers created a constant din, making focus and decision-making difficult.
even mundane tasks, such as purchasing water, firewood, or household tools, required attention, negotiation, and physical effort. Carrying goods through crowded streets added to the strain, as did ensuring that purchases were not lost, stolen, or damaged. For someone unfamiliar with these realities, the marketplace was a continuous exercise in endurance and vigilance. By the end of a visit to the Roman market, a modern person would likely be physically tired, mentally fatigued, and overwhelmed by sensory input. What might appear as simple shopping was, in reality, an intricate combination of social, physical, and cognitive challenges. The marketplace exemplified the constant demands of daily Roman life, where survival and success depended not only on endurance, but also on knowledge, awareness, and adaptability. Roman food preparation, cooking methods, and dietary challenges. Food in ancient Rome was central to daily life, yet the process of preparing and consuming it was far more labor-intensive and hazardous than a modern person might imagine. From the moment ingredients were sourced to the final meal, each step demanded attention, skill, and endurance. For the average Roman household, cooking took place over open fires or in rudimentary clay or brick ovens. Wood or charcoal was the primary fuel, requiring constant tending to maintain heat. For someone unaccustomed to these conditions, the smoke, heat, and sparks could be both uncomfortable and dangerous. Burns, eye irritation, and respiratory strain were common consequences of improper handling or carelessness. Food ingredients were far less processed than in the modern world. Grains had to be ground manually or purchased from local millers. Vegetables were washed in often limited water supplies, and meat or fish was salted or dried to extend its shelf life. Preservation was inconsistent, and the risk of spoilage was high. For a modern visitor, unfamiliar with these techniques, the possibility of consuming contaminated or improperly stored food was a constant concern. Cooking techniques themselves were simple yet demanding. Boiling, roasting, or baking required vigilance and skill,
as precise temperatures were difficult to control without modern thermometers. Overcooked food could become inedible, while undercooked meat posed serious health risks. Spices and sauces, like garum, were used liberally to enhance flavor, but the pungent aromas could be overwhelming for those unaccustomed to them. Meals were often communal, particularly in larger households or public dining spaces. This meant preparing food in quantities sufficient for multiple people, requiring significant physical effort. Carrying heavy pots of water, stirring large cauldrons, or transporting prepared food increased fatigue. Hygiene during preparation was rudimentary, with surfaces and utensils rarely sanitized in ways a modern person would expect. Cross-contamination and the spread of bacteria were inevitable. Dietary staples were relatively limited. Bread made from wheat or barley was central, supplemented by legumes, vegetables, cheese, and occasionally fruit. Meat was a luxury for most. Fish was more common in cities near the coast or rivers. Nutritional variety depended heavily on wealth and status. A modern visitor would quickly notice the scarcity of fresh proteins and the reliance on preserved or fermented foods, a stark contrast to contemporary diets.
The act of eating itself presented challenges. Utensils were basic: knives for cutting, spoons for soups, and hands for most other foods. Seating arrangements were often hard benches or stone surfaces. Meals were consumed amidst noise, smells, and bustling household activity, requiring focus and endurance to complete. Distraction, fatigue, or sensory overload could make even a simple meal exhausting. The timing of meals also differed from modern norms. Breakfast, in taculum, was light, lunch, prandium, was modest, and dinner, cena, could be elaborate, but required time, effort, and social coordination. Interruptions or mismanagement of meals could lead to dissatisfaction or social embarrassment, particularly in households with multiple family members or visiting guests. Food shortages and seasonality presented additional challenges. Without refrigeration or modern storage, certain foods were unavailable at times of the year. Reliance on preserved grains, salted fish, and legumes meant a monotonous diet, which could affect both physical health and morale. Modern humans, accustomed to global food availability, would find the limited and variable options disconcerting. In summary, the preparation, cooking, and consumption of food in ancient Rome demanded constant attention, physical effort, and adaptability. Modern expectations of sanitation, convenience, and flavor were absent, replaced by labor-intensive techniques, unpredictable outcomes, and persistent health risks. Surviving in Rome, even at the level of daily meals, required vigilance, endurance, and acceptance of discomfort.
Roman water systems, baths, and hygiene routines. Water in ancient Rome was both a necessity and a constant challenge. The city's engineers constructed aqueducts to transport fresh water from distant sources, supplying fountains, baths, and some private households. For a modern visitor, the sheer ingenuity of these systems might impress, yet the experience of using them was far from convenient or sanitary. Public fountains provided access to water, but the sources were communal and exposed. Drinking directly from a fountain required careful attention to avoid contamination from debris, insects, or other users. Modern expectations of filtration, piping, and cleanliness did not exist. Even simply obtaining water demanded physical effort, carrying heavy jars or jugs through crowded streets, often over uneven terrain. Bathing was central to Roman hygiene and social life, yet it presented its own challenges. Public baths, called thermae, were vast complexes with multiple rooms and pools of varying temperatures: the hot caldarium, the warm tepidarium, and the cold frigidarium. Patrons moved between rooms, sweating and cooling repeatedly, while attendants scraped skin with strigils to remove dirt and sweat. For a modern person, the combination of heat, humidity, crowds, and manual cleaning methods could be physically and psychologically taxing. Private baths existed for the wealthy, but water had to be manually heated, carried, and managed. Laborers or slaves often performed these tasks, adding physical strain to daily life. Even in these more controlled environments, the risk of burns, slips, or skin irritation persisted. Hygiene routines were constrained by available technology. Soap was rare. People used oils to cleanse skin, often scraping them off with tools. Dental care was minimal, relying on cloth, frayed twigs, or abrasive powders. Hair was washed with water, oil, or combs, but rarely shampooed in the modern sense. Nails were trimmed manually, and shaving was done with razors, which carried a risk of cuts or infection. A modern visitor would find these routines labor-intensive, less effective, and potentially hazardous. Shared facilities created additional risks. Latrines were communal, long benches with holes, often without privacy. Water flowed beneath to carry waste away, but odor, flies, and vermin were constant companions. Using such facilities required mental composure and a tolerance for discomfort. Disease spread easily through contact with contaminated surfaces or air. For someone accustomed to private, sanitized bathrooms, the experience could be profoundly stressful. Clothing and hygiene intersected. Washes were infrequent, and garments were reused without thorough cleaning. Sweaty tunics, dust-laden sandals, and layers of clothing carried odors, bacteria, and pests. Managing personal cleanliness under these conditions was an ongoing effort, requiring time, attention, and endurance. The combination of water collection, bathing, and hygiene tasks added physical labor to every day. Carrying heavy water containers, enduring heat and steam, and negotiating crowded facilities demanded energy and patience. The modern visitor, used to convenient plumbing and sanitation, would quickly realize that even basic hygiene in Rome required skill, effort, and resilience. By the end of the day, after walking through streets, navigating markets, performing labor, and engaging in social interactions, the rituals of water and bathing added both comfort and strain. They offered cleanliness and relief, but demanded participation in physically taxing, socially complex, and sometimes unsanitary processes. The theater and other public entertainment were equally structured. Seating was arranged according to social rank. Front rows were reserved for the wealthy, while the majority watched from farther back. Noise, movement, and vocal reactions were expected, yet regulated by unspoken rules. Engaging incorrectly, laughing at the wrong moment, speaking out of turn, or occupying the wrong seat could result in confrontation or humiliation. Even casual interactions in public spaces demanded awareness. Greetings, gestures, and facial expressions conveyed social information. A simple nod or handshake, taken for granted in modern society, might carry unintended implications. Learning to navigate these subtleties required observation, practice, and endurance. Food and drink in social settings added complexity. Dining with others required understanding proper seating arrangements, conversation topics, and etiquette for passing dishes or offering toasts. Wine was often diluted, and excessive drinking or refusal to participate could affect one's reputation. The preparation and consumption of meals were deeply intertwined with social performance. Slavery complicated social dynamics further. Slaves acted as intermediaries in many interactions, serving as guides, messengers, or assistants. Recognizing their role and the expectations of both masters and slaves was critical. Failure to understand these relationships could lead to offense, confusion, or confrontation. Even leisure activities required adherence to custom. Games, exercise, and social gatherings were structured by unwritten rules regarding participation, order, and conduct. Physical prowess, endurance, and attentiveness were often displayed publicly, and a modern visitor's lack of skill could draw negative attention.
The constant need to interpret social cues, observe hierarchy, and behave appropriately created mental strain. Unlike in modern life, where missteps are often forgiven, the rigid structure of Roman society made errors consequential. Survival, comfort, and reputation all depended on one's ability to understand and respect these customs. By the end of a full day of public interactions, the modern person would likely experience fatigue not only in the body, but in the mind. The relentless social demands, combined with physical exertion, environmental hazards, and sensory overload, made life in Rome an ongoing test of endurance. In summary, Roman social customs, public gatherings, and etiquette illustrate how deeply structured and demanding the city was. A modern visitor, accustomed to informality and privacy, would find the experience exhausting, confusing, and fraught with potential missteps. Every interaction, every gesture, and every word carried weight, making daily life a careful balancing act of observation, adaptation, and perseverance. Roman transportation, roads, and travel hazards. Travel in ancient Rome, even within the city itself, was an exercise in endurance, vigilance, and careful planning. Unlike modern transportation systems, which prioritize safety, speed, and convenience, Roman roads and modes of travel posed constant challenges to the unaccustomed traveler. The city streets were congested with pedestrians, carts, animals, and occasional wagons. Cobblestones, though expertly laid, were uneven, creating tripping hazards. Open drains, spilled liquids, and debris added to the difficulty. For a modern person accustomed to smooth pavements and sidewalks, every step required careful attention, as a single misstep could result in injury.
Beyond the city, the Roman road network was extensive, connecting towns, cities, and provinces. These roads, built with layers of stone, gravel, and sand, were engineering marvels. Yet even the best constructed roads presented challenges. Travelers faced exposure to weather, intense sun, rain, mud, and wind. Footwear provided minimal protection, and long journeys could cause blisters, sore muscles, and fatigue. Transportation vehicles were basic. Carts and wagons were often heavy, slow, and unstable. Animals, oxen, donkeys, or horses, pulled them over uneven terrain. Jostling, bumps, and sudden stops were common. For someone unaccustomed to riding in such conditions, even short journeys could be uncomfortable or painful. Accidents were frequent, and without modern medical care, injuries could escalate quickly. Water travel along the Tiber and other rivers presented additional hazards. Boats were exposed to the elements with limited safety measures. Decks were slippery, narrow, and crowded. Loading and unloading cargo required strength and balance. Capsizing or falling overboard carried real risk, particularly for a modern individual unfamiliar with rowing, balance, or river currents. Bridges, though impressive feats of engineering, required attention to avoid falls. They were often narrow and crowded with minimal guardrails. Crossing a bridge demanded coordination and focus, especially at night or during inclement weather. The threat of injury, though subtle, was ever present. Travel outside the city carried dangers beyond physical discomfort. Highwaymen, thieves, and bandits targeted travelers, especially those carrying valuables. In rural areas, assistance was rare, and local laws and protections were inconsistent. For a modern person, unaccustomed to navigating these risks, travel demanded vigilance, planning, and a tolerance for uncertainty.
Even short trips within the city, such as visiting the market, attending a bath, or walking to a neighbor's home, carried hazards. Crowded streets, uneven terrain, and competing traffic required constant alertness. Fatigue accumulated, and a modern visitor would quickly understand that Roman life demanded both mental and physical endurance simply to move from one location to another. Rest stops were minimal. Inns and taverns offered shelter for travelers, but conditions were basic at best. Sleeping arrangements were crowded, uncomfortable, and lacking privacy. Fire hazards, pests, and noise were common. Travelers had to remain alert, as crime and accidents could occur even in supposedly safe spaces. By the end of a day of travel, whether across the city or between towns, a modern person would be physically worn, mentally exhausted, and acutely aware of their vulnerabilities. The combination of rough roads, heavy loads, unstable vehicles, exposure to weather, and social hazards created an environment in which survival depended on constant vigilance, adaptability, and resilience. In summary, Roman transportation and travel highlight the endurance required to navigate the ancient world. Modern conveniences, paved streets, vehicles, public safety measures,
Hygiene remained a concern. With public baths busy during the day, evening offered limited opportunities for cleanliness. Many relied on a quick wash in cold water or a visit to small communal fountains. Water scarcity, dirt, and pollution were ongoing problems, and the threat of disease lingered. The modern person's accustomed standards of cleanliness were impossible to maintain in this environment, adding to discomfort and stress.
As darkness fully settled, the city did not entirely sleep. Fires burned in hearths, keeping homes and shops illuminated. Some taverns and inns remained open, serving wine, bread, and small meals. Street traffic decreased slightly, but noise and activity persisted. Travelers or visitors had to navigate alleys and paths with caution, as shadows concealed hazards. Loose stones, open drains, or animals roaming freely. Even a simple walk through the city could be dangerous for the uninitiated. By the time night fully arrived, the modern person, having endured sunrise, morning, midday, and evening, would likely feel a profound sense of fatigue. The combination of sensory overload, physical exertion, unfamiliar food, social pressures, and environmental hazards created an atmosphere of relentless challenge. Sleeping conditions were basic at best. Straw mattresses, hard beds, or shared sleeping spaces with family or strangers. Privacy and comfort were minimal, and warmth depended on hearths or blankets if available. In conclusion, evening in ancient Rome reinforced why survival would be difficult for a modern person. Every aspect of life, eating, moving, socializing, and sleeping, demanded adaptation to an environment and society vastly different from contemporary standards. By this point, the average day had tested not only the body, but the mind, as vigilance and endurance were necessary for every action, no matter how simple. And even as night approached, the city's rhythm, though slower, promised another day of challenges awaiting the modern intruder. Nighttime in ancient Rome. As darkness fully enveloped the city, Rome did not become entirely silent. The night brought its own challenges, risks, and sensory experiences which a modern person would find both exhausting and disorienting. Street lamps and torches were scarce, casting long shadows that obscured the uneven cobblestones and open drains. Moving through the city required careful attention to avoid trips, falls, or encounters with stray animals. For most Romans, nighttime was a time to rest, but sleep was far from uniform or comfortable. Wealthy citizens might retire to cushioned beds in private bedrooms, with attendants ensuring warmth and safety. For the majority, sleeping arrangements were basic: straw-stuffed mattresses on wooden pallets, or mats on the floor. Privacy was minimal, and the noise of the city, late-night conversations, animals, or distant traffic was a constant background. Modern humans, accustomed to quiet bedrooms and soft beds, would find the conditions jarring and sleep difficult to achieve. Health risks persisted even at night. The lack of modern sanitation meant that vermin, rats, mice, and insects were common visitors. Diseases spread easily in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Respiratory illnesses from smoke inhalation or contaminated air, gastrointestinal issues from spoiled food or contaminated water, and minor injuries from falls or burns could quickly become serious. Modern medicine and hygiene were absent. Even small wounds had the potential to worsen overnight. The streets themselves were not entirely abandoned. Some workers returned home from late shifts, while taverns and inns remained open for those seeking food, wine, or company. Travelers and merchants carried goods under the cover of darkness, relying on torches to see their way. The risk of theft, assault, or accidental injury was high. A modern person unfamiliar with the city or without local knowledge would find navigating these spaces particularly hazardous.
Noise, too, was unrelenting. The distant barking of dogs, the occasional braying of donkeys, and the calls of night watchmen patrolling the streets created a constant ambient sound. Unlike the modern experience of night, where darkness often signals quiet, Roman nights demanded continued alertness, even while resting. Light sleepers might awaken repeatedly, startled by a nearby commotion or the movement of people and animals. Personal safety was a major concern. Street lighting was minimal, and law enforcement rudimentary. Thieves and opportunists were active at night, particularly in crowded neighborhoods or poorly lit alleyways. For someone from the modern world, accustomed to structured policing and emergency services, the vulnerability to theft or violence could be deeply unsettling. For those who survived the day without serious injury or illness, sleep was a necessity, but rarely luxurious. Sharing a room with family, fellow workers, or even strangers meant limited space and minimal comfort. Warmth depended on the fire, blankets, or clothing, and drafts from windows or gaps in walls were common. Noise and odor from nearby animals, latrines, or neighboring households could intrude continuously, making rest light and fragmented. Even in this most ordinary hour, survival was not guaranteed. A simple misstep, slipping on a wet floor, drinking contaminated water, or coming into conflict with a neighbor could lead to injury or illness. Modern humans, used to predictable environments and emergency response, would struggle to adapt to these realities. Nighttime in ancient Rome emphasized the constant demands of survival. Even as people slept, hazards persisted, and the city's rhythm remained active beneath the dim glow of torches. The combination of exhaustion from the day, physical discomfort, and environmental risks created an atmosphere that challenged every modern expectation of rest and security.
By the end of the night, a modern visitor would likely awaken with more fatigue than rest, aware that each new day promised a repetition of the sensory, physical, and social challenges that had already tested them to their limits. And so the cycle of survival continued, hour by hour, day by day, in a city that was alive, vibrant, and unforgiving to the unprepared. Health hazards and medical practices in ancient Rome. For a modern person, one of the most sobering aspects of life in ancient Rome was the constant threat of illness and injury. Medical knowledge was limited, sanitation was poor, and even minor ailments could escalate into serious problems. From the moment you awoke to the moment you attempted to sleep, your body was exposed to countless risks. Water sources were often contaminated. While aqueducts brought fresh water to public fountains, nearby rivers, wells, and cisterns were susceptible to pollution. Drinking water could carry bacteria or parasites that modern filtration systems would normally eliminate. Consuming this water could result in diarrhea, vomiting, or fever. In a society without antibiotics or modern treatment, such illnesses could become life-threatening, particularly if compounded by fatigue, malnutrition, or unsanitary living conditions. Food safety was another concern. Romans did not have refrigeration. Meat, fish, and dairy products were prone to spoilage, especially in warm weather. Street vendors offered food that may have been left in the sun or handled by multiple people, increasing the risk of contamination. Even seemingly harmless staples like bread could harbor mold or bacteria. A modern digestive system, accustomed to controlled environments, might react severely to these exposures.
Injuries were frequent. Uneven streets, open drains, heavy carts, and busy marketplaces created constant hazards. Slips, trips, and falls could result in sprains, fractures, or cuts. Open flames from cooking fires, forges, and lamps posed burn risks. In a world without emergency medicine, minor wounds could become infected, leading to more severe complications. The physical environment alone was a constant test of coordination and endurance. Disease spread easily due to crowded living conditions. Insulae housed many families in close quarters, sharing limited ventilation and communal spaces. Latrines, though designed to carry waste away, often contributed to the spread of pathogens. Respiratory illnesses, skin infections, and gastrointestinal diseases were common. Epidemics occasionally swept through the city, claiming lives indiscriminately. A modern person with no immunity to these endemic pathogens would be especially vulnerable. Medical practices were rudimentary. Physicians, or medici, relied on herbal remedies, poultices, and techniques inherited from Greek medicine. Bloodletting, purging, and other treatments were common, though their effectiveness was inconsistent. Surgery existed, but was risky and painful, performed without anesthesia. The average Roman household had access to limited medical knowledge, usually based on family tradition or local practitioners. A modern person expecting contemporary healthcare would find the remedies inadequate and frightening. Mental strain was another hazard. The constant vigilance required to navigate streets, markets, social hierarchies, and the sensory environment of Rome placed stress on the mind and body. Fatigue, anxiety, and confusion were natural responses to this overwhelming setting. Without modern support systems, sleep, nutrition, and rest were the only tools available to mitigate mental and physical exhaustion.
Even preventive measures were limited. Romans understood basic hygiene in theory, bathing, hand washing, and cleaning wounds, but practical execution was inconsistent. Soap was uncommon, and disinfectants were minimal. Clothing and bedding were washed sporadically,
and insects or rodents were never fully controlled. Every day presented exposure to bacteria, parasites, and pests, making survival a constant struggle against invisible threats. By the end of the day, a modern person would realize that even mundane actions carried risk. Eating a meal, drinking water, walking down a street, or resting in a crowded insula could expose them to harm. The combination of environmental, social, and biological hazards made each day a trial. Health in ancient Rome was a fragile balance easily disrupted by misfortune, negligence, or simple bad luck. Understanding these dangers clarifies why survival would be so difficult for a modern human. Modern conveniences, clean water, refrigeration, emergency medicine, and sanitation shield us from countless threats that Romans faced daily. In their absence, every hour of life demanded awareness, endurance, and caution. The city, vibrant and bustling, was also unforgiving and indifferent to the weaknesses of those unaccustomed to its realities. Clothing, daily labor, and physical exertion in ancient Rome. Another aspect of life that would challenge a modern visitor is the clothing and physical demands of ancient Rome. From dawn to dusk, the Roman body was rarely at rest, and the garments they wore added a layer of complexity to daily life.
Most Romans wore simple tunics, short-sleeved garments made from wool or linen. For men, the tunic often reached the knees, while women's tunics extended to the ankles, sometimes layered with stolas or pallas for modesty and style. Clothing was heavy when wet, itchy against the skin, and generally cumbersome. Wool, while warm, caused perspiration and chafing in hot weather. Linen, lighter but less durable, offered some relief, but still restricted movement compared to modern fabrics. For someone accustomed to stretchable, breathable, and moisture-wicking clothing, this alone would be a constant irritation. The wealthy wore togas, a long, draped garment requiring skill to arrange correctly. Tying a toga improperly could result in embarrassment or social disapproval. A modern person unfamiliar with such clothing would struggle with both the weight and the complexity of these garments. Walking, sitting, or performing even simple tasks required care to avoid tripping or stepping on the folds of fabric. Footwear presented another challenge. Sandals, often made from leather straps, offered minimal support and no cushioning. Hard, uneven cobblestones and the occasional muddy street made walking long distances uncomfortable and even painful. For laborers, sturdy leather shoes or boots provided some protection, but even these were rudimentary compared to modern designs. Blisters, cuts, and sore feet were common complaints. Physical labor dominated daily life for most Romans. Slaves, artisans, and laborers performed strenuous tasks, hauling stone, carrying water, working in blacksmith shops, or tending to livestock. Even tradespeople who worked indoors spent hours standing, bending, and lifting heavy objects. The work required endurance, strength, and coordination. A modern person accustomed to sedentary office work or mechanized labor would quickly tire under these demands.
Labor was continuous. There were few regulated breaks, and the concept of labor laws or safety equipment was non-existent. Tasks were performed in crowded spaces, with exposure to heat, smoke, dust, or noise. The risk of injury was constant. Dropping a heavy object, slipping on a wet floor, or being struck by tools or animals could have serious consequences. Modern first aid and protective gear were unavailable,
so even minor injuries could become dangerous. For women, physical exertion included both domestic labor and social obligations. Preparing meals over open fires, fetching water, cleaning living spaces, and tending to children required hours of continuous activity. Wealthier women, though relieved from some manual labor by slaves, still faced physical demands in managing households, attending public baths, and navigating social events. A modern woman or man, unaccustomed to this combination of domestic and public labor, would experience significant fatigue. Even for children, life was physically demanding. Education, when available, often included walking long distances to schools or tutors. Play was rarely sedentary, as children were expected to assist in household chores or apprenticeships from an early age. The concept of free time, as understood in the modern sense, was largely absent. By late afternoon, the cumulative effect of clothing, walking, and labor would leave a modern person physically exhausted. The body, unadapted to constant exertion without modern conveniences like ergonomic furniture, soft bedding, or climate control, would signal fatigue in every muscle. Simple movements could become strenuous, and recovery was slow without modern nutrition or medical care. In summary, the combination of clothing and labor created a constant, low-level strain on the body. Every step, every task, and every social obligation demanded effort. For a modern visitor, the unfamiliar fabrics, minimal footwear, and relentless work would quickly lead to fatigue and discomfort. The physicality of daily Roman life was a silent but powerful reminder that survival in this ancient city required both strength and resilience.
Roman streets, transportation, and urban hazards. Navigating the streets of ancient Rome was a task that required constant vigilance. Unlike modern cities with regulated traffic, traffic lights, and sidewalks, Rome's streets were a chaotic mixture of pedestrians, animals, carts, and occasional wagons carrying goods across the city. For a modern person, the experience could be exhausting, confusing, and even dangerous. Cobblestones lined the streets, often uneven and slick from rain or spilled liquids. Mud accumulated in low spots, and open drains ran alongside buildings or down the middle of roads. Slipping or tripping was a frequent hazard, and even a minor fall could result in injuries that, in the absence of modern medical care, could become serious. Every step demanded attention, and the city seemed to punish inattention. Traffic itself was relentless. Donkeys, mules, and oxen hauled carts overloaded with goods. Drivers shouted, animals brayed, and the sound of hooves striking stone created a constant din. Pedestrians jostled one another to avoid being struck or trampled. For someone used to orderly streets, crosswalks, or traffic signals, the unpredictability of Roman roads was a persistent source of stress. Street corners were particularly hazardous. Merchants and hawkers occupied every available space, selling food, pottery, textiles, and miscellaneous goods. The smell of cooking fires, combined with the pungency of uncollected waste, could overwhelm the senses. A modern visitor might stumble into a vendor's stall or knock over a display, drawing anger or ridicule. Crowding made it difficult to maintain balance, and the combination of smells, noise, and human activity could be physically and mentally draining.
Roman bridges and thoroughfares presented additional challenges. While impressive in engineering, many were narrow, lacking guardrails, and crowded with both people and carts. Crossing a bridge required careful timing and attention to avoid accidents. The risk of falling into the river, particularly at night or in poor weather, was real. For someone unfamiliar with the layout of the city, navigating these structures could be disorienting. Water transport, though available, was equally demanding. Boats along the Tiber River were used to carry goods and passengers, but loading and unloading were labor-intensive. Decks were narrow and slippery, and balance was crucial. For a modern person accustomed to stable platforms and safety measures, the physical demands of river travel were considerable. Urban hazards extended to environmental risks as well. Fires were a constant threat. Open flames were used in cooking, lighting, and heating, and buildings were constructed largely of wood. A single accident could spread quickly, and the lack of organized firefighting meant communities had to rely on buckets of water or primitive pumps. Smoke inhalation, burns, or structural collapse were realistic dangers, particularly for those unfamiliar with the environment. Crime and theft were also prevalent. Pickpockets, thieves, and opportunistic criminals exploited crowded streets and poorly lit areas. Vigilance was necessary at all times. A modern visitor carrying unfamiliar coins or goods would be an easy target. Social rules dictated how disputes were handled, often requiring negotiation or physical confrontation without legal recourse. Even after a short period, the cumulative effect of these hazards, uneven streets, heavy crowds, animals, noise, and the threat of injury or theft would be physically and mentally exhausting. Every movement required attention, and every step carried potential risk. The city, vibrant and productive, was simultaneously unforgiving to the unprepared. By the end of a single day navigating these straits, a modern person would likely feel an overwhelming fatigue. The physical exertion, sensory overload, and constant vigilance required to survive even simple tasks made the city an environment of persistent challenge. Modern expectations of safety, predictability, and comfort were rendered irrelevant in the chaos of urban Rome. Roman markets, shopping, and interactions with merchants. The markets of ancient Rome were central to daily life, bustling hubs of activity that could overwhelm a modern visitor with their intensity and complexity. From dawn until late afternoon, citizens crowded into these spaces, purchasing food, clothing, tools, and other essentials. For someone unaccustomed to the pace, smells, and noise, simply moving through a marketplace could feel exhausting. Market stalls, often constructed of wood or cloth, were packed closely together. Merchants displayed their goods with care, yet the proximity of neighboring stalls meant that space was limited. Moving through the market required constant attention to avoid knocking over items or bumping into fellow shoppers. For a modern person used to organized aisles and regulated displays, the close quarters and disorderly arrangement could be disorienting. Vendors called out their wares continuously, their voices carrying across the crowded space. Fishmongers shouted the freshness of their catch, bakers advertised loaves of bread, and potters displayed their ceramics with pride. The constant auditory bombardment demanded mental focus to process, filter, and respond appropriately. A modern visitor might find this overwhelming, even stressful.
Haggling was expected in Roman markets. Prices were not fixed, and negotiation was a skill, sometimes combative. To purchase even simple items, a buyer had to argue convincingly, show knowledge of fair value, and maintain composure under pressure.
Imagine, if you will, the faint light of dawn creeping over the terracotta rooftops of a Roman insula. The air is cool, damp with the faint scent of the Tiber River nearby, mingled with the less pleasant aromas of open sewers and livestock pens. In Rome, the city never truly sleeps, but the earliest stirrings of daily life begin now. If you, a modern person,
were suddenly placed in this environment, the first challenge would be the sheer density of life. Romans lived in crowded apartment blocks called insulae, some rising 5 or 6 stories high. The wooden beams of these buildings creaked and groaned, and the stairways were narrow and steep. There were no elevators, of course, and the idea of safety regulations was virtually non-existent. One misstep on the uneven stairs could easily result in a broken leg, a serious problem in a world without modern hospitals. Your morning would likely begin with the cacophony of the city, the braying of donkeys, the clatter of carts over cobblestones, the shouts of street vendors selling bread, olives, fish, and garum, a pungent fermented fish sauce beloved by Romans. Imagine opening your eyes to this auditory and olfactory assault. For someone accustomed to air conditioning, modern plumbing, and alarm clocks, this would be both confusing and exhausting. Hygiene, or rather the lack of modern hygiene, presents another immediate shock. Romans did not have running hot water in their homes, and bathing was a public affair for most citizens. The wealthy might have private baths, but even then, the water had to be heated manually. For the majority, a visit to the public baths involved navigating crowded spaces filled with strangers, hot, steamy rooms, and water that was rarely sparkling clean by modern standards. The smell, again, was something to reckon with, a mix of sweat, oils, and the lingering scent of the communal baths.
Breakfast, or orientaculum, as the Romans called it, was simple. Bread, sometimes dipped in wine, occasionally with cheese or olives. The concept of a fresh cup of coffee or cereal would be entirely foreign. Meals were eaten quickly and often on the go, particularly for laborers and tradespeople who had little leisure time. You might try to linger over breakfast, but the pressures of city life would push you into the streets almost immediately. Navigating Rome's streets would be another ordeal. Cobblestones were uneven, slippery when wet, and crowded with pedestrians, animals, and carts. Street traffic rules were rudimentary at best. Jaywalking could be fatal. The streets were also often foul-smelling, with waste from homes and shops dumped directly onto the thoroughfares. For a modern person used to sanitized sidewalks and asphalt roads, this sensory overload could be overwhelming. Even observing the people would be exhausting. Romans wore togas and tunics, garments that may seem elegant in depictions, but were restrictive and cumbersome in reality. Slaves moved quickly and efficiently, while citizens hurried about their business, negotiating, shouting, and gesturing wildly. Public life was loud, crowded, and relentless, with every sense engaged and overstimulated. And yet this was only the beginning of the day. By mid-morning, the city would be in full swing. Markets bustling, workshops clanging with the sounds of metal and wood, and the aroma of cooking food permeating every corner. For a modern person used to sanitized sidewalks and asphalt roads, this sensory overload could be unbearable.
In summary, if you woke up in an ancient Roman insula tomorrow, the first hour alone could convince you that survival would be impossible. The sights, sounds, and smells of the city were intense, the living conditions primitive by modern standards, and the risks of injury or illness high. And this is merely the start of your day in Rome. Morning in ancient Rome. By mid-morning, the streets of Rome were alive in a way that could feel almost chaotic to a modern visitor. Merchants and artisans had fully set up their stalls and workshops, their voices carrying over the din of carts and pedestrians. If you had survived the initial sensory overload of dawn, this would present a new challenge: understanding the rhythm of the city and keeping pace with its residents. Laborers and craftsmen were already hard at work,
Blacksmiths hammered at molten metal, sparks flying into the air. Cobblers cut and stitched leather, the smell of tanned hides blending with the aroma of fresh bread from nearby bakers. Potters shaped clay on their wheels, water sloshing as they worked, while fishmongers displayed their catch on ice, or, more accurately, in baskets of straw with only a thin layer of water. For someone used to climate-controlled environments and modern machinery, the physicality and intensity of these tasks could be exhausting just to observe.
Roman social customs, too, demanded attention. The city was stratified. Patricians, plebeians, freedmen, and slaves each had their place and privileges. Walking into the wrong area or speaking to the wrong person could attract unwanted attention. A stranger like you, without the subtle understanding of status and etiquette, could unintentionally offend someone, risking verbal or even physical confrontation. Survival, it seemed, required constant vigilance. And then there were the smells. The Tiber River was nearby, and its stagnant sections produced a pungent odor. Human and animal waste, often dumped into the streets or canals, added to the mix. Cooking fires and open flames brought smoky aromas, while the marketplaces offered the smell of fresh produce, fish, and fermented sauces. The constant mixture of pleasant and unpleasant smells could make your stomach churn, particularly as you tried to move through the crowds without collapsing from nausea. Public latrines were another necessary yet challenging aspect of life. Modern plumbing did not exist. Latrines were communal, long benches with holes, and water flowed beneath to carry away waste. Privacy was minimal, and hygiene standards were lower than anything a modern person could imagine. Using such facilities would be daunting, and the risk of contracting disease was significant. By the time the sun rose higher, the heat added a further burden. Rome's summer days could be sweltering, and without modern cooling, shade and water were precious commodities. The combination of sun, humidity, and exertion made the city an exhausting place to navigate, even for seasoned Romans. A modern person, accustomed to climate control, would struggle to endure more than a few hours without retreating to some kind of shelter.
By late morning, the city's rhythm became almost hypnotic. Street traffic continued unabated. Merchants called out their wares, slaves carried heavy loads, and citizens hurried about their business. For a visitor from the modern world, every step was a calculation: where to walk, how to avoid injury, how to interact without causing offense. Even simply observing without participating could be mentally draining. Thus, the morning alone in ancient Rome, less than half a day, reveals why survival would be so challenging. Between the crowds, the smells, the unfamiliar social hierarchies, and the relentless pace of labor and commerce, the modern visitor is already tested. And yet the day was only beginning. There were still meals, religious rituals, entertainment, and political gatherings to endure. By this point, a modern person might already long for the quiet streets and conveniences of contemporary life. But in Rome, the next challenge awaited: the midday routines, where work and leisure intersected, and where your senses would be further assaulted by both the city and its people. Midday in ancient Rome. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the city of Rome reached the height of its daily activity. The streets, which had already been crowded during the morning, became even more congested with people, animals, and carts transporting goods to and from markets. For a modern person, simply moving from one place to another required constant vigilance. One misstep to mean tripping over uneven cobblestones, colliding with a donkey cart, or being jostled into a pile of discarded refuse. The rhythm of movement in the city was relentless, and there was no mechanism to pause or slow it for the uninitiated.
For Romans, midday often included a meal called the cena, though for many laborers it was lighter and taken on the go. Bread remained the staple, sometimes accompanied by cheese, olives, or a small portion of meat if affordable. Fish, usually salted or dried, was common, as were vegetables like lentils, cabbage, and onions. Garum, the ubiquitous fermented fish sauce, flavored almost everything. The smell was pungent, and the taste was unfamiliar to modern palates. Consuming this food while standing in the street or navigating a marketplace could be a challenging task, requiring careful attention to avoid spills or accidents. For those who could afford it, public baths became a midday retreat. The baths were a cornerstone of Roman life, a place to cleanse, socialize, and relax. However, the experience was far from the quiet and private bathing of modern life. Rooms were steamy and crowded, often with dozens of strangers. Pools varied in temperature. The caldarium was hot, the tepidarium warm, and the frigidarium cold. Patrons moved between pools, sweating and shivering, while attendants scraped their skin with strigils to remove sweat and dirt. For a modern person, the communal nature, noise, and tactile intensity of this environment could induce both discomfort and stress. Hygiene in the baths was not what one would consider sanitary by contemporary standards. The water was used by many people and not changed frequently, making infection and skin irritation common. Slipping on wet stone floors or bumping into others was a constant risk. The combination of heat, moisture, and crowded conditions could leave a modern visitor feeling drained after only a short time.
Meanwhile, the midday streets continued to buzz. Street performers and musicians offered entertainment, sometimes skillful, sometimes chaotic. Merchants hawked goods from all corners of the known world: spices, fabrics, pottery, and tools. The cacophony of sound, combined with constant movement and the ever-present smells of food, refuse, and livestock, formed a sensory landscape that was difficult to endure. A modern person, accustomed to predictable and sanitized environments, would find it overwhelming. Political life also intertwined with daily routines. Romans often gathered in public spaces such as the Forum to discuss civic matters, engage in debates, or witness judicial proceedings. These gatherings were loud, competitive, and highly public. Participation required awareness of social norms, knowledge of local politics, and the ability to navigate verbal confrontations, all without the modern protections of anonymity or law enforcement readily available to protect a bewildered newcomer. By mid-afternoon, fatigue would begin to set in. The heat of the day, the physical exertion required to move through the streets, and the constant mental alertness necessary to avoid accidents or social faux pas combined to produce exhaustion. For a modern person, even sitting down for a moment could be difficult. Seating was often limited to wooden benches or stone steps, and shade was scarce. Drinking water was available, but only from public fountains or aqueduct-fed sources, and modern concerns about water purity would make every sip a potential risk. The midday routines of ancient Rome illustrate why survival would be taxing for a modern individual. Laborers, artisans, merchants, and slaves had adapted to this life through years of habituation, physical conditioning, and social understanding. A modern visitor, unfamiliar with these rhythms and lacking their endurance, would find even the most mundane tasks, walking, eating, bathing, or simply observing, mentally and physically exhausting.
Even now, before the day had reached its peak, the modern person would likely begin longing for the comforts of home, the soft furniture, climate control, clean water, and predictable food of contemporary life. In ancient Rome, none of these existed. Each moment demanded awareness, effort, and adaptation. And as the afternoon approached, new challenges awaited: more strenuous labor, additional sensory overload, and the complexities of evening rituals and entertainment.
Afternoon in ancient Rome, as the afternoon sun climbed toward its zenith, the streets of Rome remained as congested and lively as ever. Merchants continued their bargaining, artisans maintained their workshops, and laborers hauled goods through narrow alleyways and broad thoroughfares alike. For a modern person, simply standing still without being jostled would be a challenge. Every step required careful attention to uneven cobblestones, stray animals, and the occasional overflowing gutter. In many trades, the afternoon marked the busiest part of the day. Bakers finished kneading and baking bread in brick ovens, the smell of fresh loaves mingling with the pervasive scents of the streets. Blacksmiths, artisans, and construction workers were deeply engaged in labor, their arms and bodies straining with physical exertion. Observing them, a modern person might feel the fatigue of their labors almost vicariously. The strength and stamina required to perform these tasks daily was something unfamiliar and demanding for someone accustomed to minimal physical exertion in modern life. Meanwhile, in the Forum, the city's political heart, discussions and disputes carried on without pause. Debates over civic issues, legal matters, and public announcements created a constant background of shouting, gestures, and rhetorical flourish. For a modern visitor, unfamiliar with the language, customs, and social expectations, the cacophony could be overwhelming. Interpreting even the most basic social signals required constant attention, and a single misstep could provoke anger or ridicule. Food continued to play a central role in the afternoon. Lunch, or prandium, was typically light: cold bread, cheese, olives, and sometimes fruit. For those with means, leftovers from the previous night's meal or more exotic delicacies might be included. The absence of refrigeration meant that food spoilage was common. Eating improperly stored food could result in illness, a risk compounded by the lack of modern medical remedies. For a modern person, the prospect of ingesting unfamiliar or spoiled food was daunting. Baths, too, were popular in the afternoon. Roman citizens sought relief from the heat and exertion of the day in public baths, while slaves and laborers often bathed at the end of their shifts. The crowded, communal nature of bathing, along with the variable cleanliness of water and facilities, posed a risk both physically and psychologically. Modern visitors, used to privacy and strict sanitation standards, might feel disoriented or uncomfortable for hours afterward. Social hierarchies dictated behavior throughout the city. The patricians moved with confidence, protected by slaves and social standing, while plebeians and freedmen navigated the streets with a careful awareness of whom they approached and how they spoke. Slaves, meanwhile, had little autonomy and faced constant demands from their masters. Observing this rigid structure, a modern person unfamiliar with the rules might inadvertently offend or attract negative attention, a subtle but constant threat to personal safety.
By mid-afternoon, the sun's intensity and the persistent activity created a palpable weariness. Heat, humidity, and dust added to the challenge of navigating the streets. Even resting offered little reprieve. Benches were hard, shade was scarce, and the constant flow of people made finding quiet nearly impossible. Every inhalation brought a mix of scents: cooking fires, waste, sweat, livestock, that modern lungs were ill-prepared to process for long durations. Entertainment, though a relief for Romans, could be another trial for a visitor. Street performers, jugglers, and musicians sought attention with loud displays. Chariot races, theatrical performances, or gladiatorial games were spectacles, but attending required physical endurance to withstand crowds, sun, and noise. Seating was often uncomfortable, and facilities were minimal. Even the simplest pleasures demanded a high tolerance for discomfort and chaos. The afternoon, though seemingly mundane, demonstrated why surviving in ancient Rome was a challenge for the unaccustomed. Every activity, from walking through crowded streets to observing political life, eating unfamiliar foods, or navigating social hierarchies, required constant mental and physical adaptation. The modern visitor's expectations of safety, hygiene, and personal space were continuously violated. By this stage of the day, it becomes clear the modern human body and mind are ill-suited for the relentless pace, sensory overload, and social intricacies of Rome. The city was vibrant, productive, and deeply social, yet to a stranger, every hour was a test of endurance, patience, and adaptability. And as the sun began to descend, the evening would introduce new challenges: crowded dinner tables, night markets, and the dimly lit streets of a city that never fully sleeps. Evening in ancient Rome. As the afternoon sun began to descend toward the horizon, the city of Rome entered its evening phase. Shadows lengthened across the streets, stretching along the uneven cobblestones and the facades of multi-story insulae. For a modern person, this might provide a brief respite from the heat of the day, but it also marked a new set of challenges: dimming light, cooler temperatures, and the constant activity of the city preparing for night. The evening meal, or cena, was often the largest of the day for those who could afford it. For the wealthy, it might consist of multiple courses: meats, fish, legumes, vegetables, and occasionally exotic imports such as dates or spices from distant provinces. Servants would attend to every detail, ensuring food was served in proper order. For a modern visitor, the abundance of unfamiliar dishes, combined with intricate etiquette, could be overwhelming. One misstep in serving order, seating arrangements, or conversation could draw reproach from hosts or fellow diners. For the average citizen or laborer, dinner was simpler: bread, cheese, vegetables, and perhaps a small portion of meat. The lack of refrigeration or sanitation made foodborne illness a real concern, particularly if leftovers were consumed. In crowded households, the preparation of meals often created smoke, heat, and additional smells, all contributing to sensory fatigue. A modern person unused to such environments might find even sitting down to eat an exhausting task. The streets remained busy well into the evening. Market stalls were being packed up, carts moved goods to storage, and craftsmen closed their workshops. Noise continued unabated. Shouting, laughter, and the braying of animals persisted. Dim torches or oil lamps provided the only illumination in many areas, casting flickering shadows across the stone streets. For someone accustomed to electric lighting, navigating these poorly lit spaces required concentration and caution to avoid injury. Public entertainment extended into the evening as well. Theaters, amphitheaters, and circuses offered performances, games, and spectacles for citizens of all classes. Attendance required patience and endurance. Seats were hard, the crowd dense, and personal space minimal. Noise levels, from applause to jeering, could be intense. Even observing from the back of a theater or open forum was taxing, as the din, smells, and heat combined into an immersive, almost oppressive experience. Social interactions continued to be complex. Romans conversed in formalized manners, signaling status and allegiance through subtle gestures and tone. Misreading these cues could create tension or embarrassment. Slaves moved attentively among guests, serving food and drink, while ensuring the desires of their masters were fulfilled. A modern person, unfamiliar with such social hierarchies, risked unintentional offenses.
The need for constant vigilance and awareness made the evening mentally exhausting.